Hey guys, welcome to week 3. In week 3, we are going to take a look at 2 chapters. We are looking at chapters 10 and 13. In chapter 10, we're going to look at, in this video, chapter 10, we're looking at the nervous system. So we're going to talk about the nervous system, different divisions of the nervous system, how it functions, and we're going to look at the brain. The brain is the massive part of the nervous system, so we'll look at different parts of the brain as well. And then in chapter 13, we'll take a look at our sensory division, which is definitely tied to our nerves, our ability to see, hear, speak, taste, all of those things. Speak is not part of that sense, I guess, but our ability to taste and smell are definitely part of our nervous system. So we're going to look at that in chapter 13. So let's go ahead and let's get started with chapter 10. So I am going to share my screen with you and go ahead and pull up chapter 10 here. So let me go ahead and start from the beginning of our PowerPoint here. Okay, so following along in chapter 10, again, looking at the nervous tissue and brain, we're going to look at how that functions. If there's anything that, as we go through this PowerPoint, if there's anything I feel that you guys really need to focus on or don't need to focus on, you guys know I will mention that to you guys. So I've already cut up the PowerPoint a little bit, cutting out some things that I thought weren't completely necessary. So you may still see them in your text if you're looking in your book. But we are going to take a look at the 2 divisions of the nervous system. We're going to look at the general functions of the nervous system. We'll get into the cellular composition of the nervous system, so looking at certain nerve cells, looking at surrounding nerve tissue. So we'll look at what's called neuroglia and then also a neuron. And then briefly, when we talk about a neuron, I'm going to briefly explain to you guys what the myelin sheath is. So I'll explain to that real briefly, but I don't go into great detail about it. As far as how a neuron transfers information, I will also be real brief with that. I'll talk to you guys about how that nerve transmission takes place, but I don't go into a huge amount of detail. So I'll show you guys what I mean when I get there. And then get into the synapse, which is just the space between 2 neurons. Let's go a little bit further with that. Okay, so if we were to look at the nervous system as a whole, the nervous system is divided into 2 overall divisions. We have what's called the central nervous division, or central nervous system, abbreviated as CNS. The central nervous system, in this picture you guys can see the brain and the spinal cord right here in the middle. That is the extent of the central nervous system. That's it. It's just the brain and the spinal cord. Everything is centered around that brain and spinal cord. Not only is it centrally located, but also it's the main hub of our nervous system here. Everything is tied to either the brain or the spinal cord. Every message that's sent in our entire body is sent through the brain and the spinal cord. And that's what the nervous system is. It's going to be a series of electrical impulses that are being sent to and from different parts of our body so that our body can respond in the way that it needs to, and whether it's maintaining homeostasis or what have you. There's a reason why we do things, and our brain is going to be what's in control of that, or our spinal cord. Our spinal cord is responsible for a lot of our reflex actions, so that's also in control. But that's what happens. That's how we can look at the nervous system, is that it's our wiring system of our body. Just like in a room, if I were to flip that light switch over there on that wall, if I were to flip that switch, well, right now it's on. If I were to flip it down, then we know that what would happen is there would be a message that's sent through the wiring and up to the lights up here in my office, and it would turn the lights off. Same thing if I did the reverse. If I flipped the light switch on, then it would turn the lights back on. And that is the same way our nervous system works, that there is a response that needs to be elicited, or just a message that needs to be sent to a different part of our body, and our brain or our spinal cord is going to tell us how to do that. Whereas the peripheral nervous system, those are all of those wires. All of those wires that come off of our brain and our spinal cord, the ones where these messages are being sent, that's what's called the peripheral. So think they're located on the periphery of the brain and the spinal cord is how I think about that. So those are 2 main divisions of the nervous system. We'll be able to divide those a little bit further, as the central nervous system, as I mentioned, is the brain and the spinal cord, which we'll talk pretty heavily about the brain at the end of this chapter. Whereas our peripheral nervous system, we'll later be able to talk about how that can be divided into the somatic or autonomic divisions. So let's take a look at this. So that's what it's getting into here a little bit further. So we have our functions of the nervous system. Our functions are to send messages to and from different parts of our body. We have sensory functions as far as we can sense what's going on because of our brain and our spinal cord telling us these things. Our integrative, so you can see in this picture, he's looking at just the cat with the empty bowl, and so we can sense and we can see that. That's what we'll talk about in chapter 13, which our ability to see. But in our integrative, this requires our thought process now. Yes, we could see the empty bowl of cat food, but we could have done nothing with that. But there's a part in our brain that has that thought process that now we can put together. Oh, the empty bowl of food, that sad looking cat. Oh, that cat must be hungry. So that's our integrative. And then we have the motor, which is our movement, also known as our somatic division. This is the part of the nervous system that's under our control. Just like we talked about with last week when we talked about our bones and our muscles, that we have the somatic control, that's the skeletal muscle is the only thing under voluntary control. And our nervous system that controls that is also called the somatic division of our nerves. And so that's what's happening, is now we choose to then feed the cat, and that's our motor division there. So looking at the nervous system itself, so we've got the nerves itself, I should say, the tissues that make up this. So if we were to look inside of the nerves and what makes that up, earlier we've talked about how, yes, we have, in chapter 1, we talked about how cells make up tissues, tissues make up organs, organs make up organ systems. So here in our nervous system, nerves are the organs in this chapter. We do have specific organs like the brain and the spinal cord, but they're made up of these cells. So the tissues that we're looking at here, this tissue called nervous tissue, is made up of neurons. So neurons are the cells, the main cells in our nervous system. These are the ones that are responsible for sending messages to and from different parts of the body. They're the ones that are doing the communicating for the nervous system. They're long. That long shape also therefore makes them delicate, makes them a little bit fragile, and why the nerves are sometimes very difficult to heal. Sometimes nerve damage is sometimes permanent, and oftentimes that depends on where the nerve damage takes place. But it does make them very fragile. That's where the neuroglia come in. Neuroglia, sometimes called glial cells. This is the most abundant type. We have these all over the nervous system, but their job is to protect these neurons. So they support, they protect and insulate, as well as nourish, and just generally care for those neurons. So I think on the next slide, we're going to take a look at what a neuron looks like. And then just know that neuroglia, their job is to kind of surround those neurons to make sure that they're protected. So here's what a neuron looks like. This is, again, the type of cell in our body that's doing the communicating. So we've got the top of the neuron here. This is, you can still see the cell body. We've got dendrites coming off the cell body. Then we've got the axon. The arrow right here shows us that this is the direction that a nerve impulse will be sent. I'm going to give you an example here, just to kind of show you guys for just a second. Let's say I wanted to see if there was a way that you guys could see me a little bit better. Okay, let me do this for a second. Let's say that I go and lay my hand on a hot stove. So I'm facing a hot stove right here. We know what's going to happen, right? When I go to lay my hand on a hot stove, I'm going to jerk my hand away. Absolutely. We all know that that's what's going to happen. But here's what's happening in this response. What happens is my fingertips, they have nerve endings in my fingertips. When I go and touch that hot surface, there's that series of wires that we were talking about, our nerves. Those nerves that are, which we're going to get into this, but these are called our sensory nerves. So they're the ones that are picking up on that sensation of heat, but I haven't interpreted it as hot yet. I know that obviously this is very fast, but here's how this happens. Those sensory nerves will travel up my arm and into my central nervous system, so my brain and my spinal cord. Since this is more of a reflex action, this is going to be my spinal cord that's responsible for this particular action. But in any case, the sensory nerves will make it to the central nervous system. It's in the central nervous system that brain or spinal cord, in this case of a hot stove with a reflex, it's again spinal cord, will say, oh, hey, that's hot. You need to respond by removing your hand. Again, it takes place much faster than that. But from there, then a motor message is sent, meaning that a response needs to take place. So from there, through a different nerve, my body is going to send that message down to my muscles in my arm to tell me to move my hand off of that hot stove. So what happens is, now that we're talking about these neurons, what makes up that long wire or nerve, I called it a wire, but again, in that relationship there, that nerve is made up of a series of neurons. Let's go back to that picture of that neuron for a second. So let me go back to this. So the neuron, what this is, and you can see that impulse is traveling this way. What happens is there's another neuron right underneath that. There's another neuron beneath that one. There's another neuron beneath that one. And that's how this message is going to be sent. So let's imagine this particular neuron is the neuron in my fingertips, in that example of my hot stove situation there. That what happens is when I touch that hot stove, these dendrites, the very first part of the neuron here, so I always think about those as kind of like the finger-like ends, the ones that are going to receive that message. So they have these receptors that pick up that sensation, okay, so that impulse, in this case of heat. It could be anything else, but we're looking at this situation here as that heat. And that message is going to be sent through the cell body, through the axon, to these axon terminals, and then across a synapse, which is the space between two neurons, and I'll get into that, to the next neuron. The same thing happens through that one, and then it goes to the next neuron, to the next neuron, to the next one, until it reaches my central nervous system, where that message can be interpreted. And then from there, that message is sent again, now down to my hand, and then I remove my hand. So that's what the neuron looks like, is this right here. We've got, I'd be familiar with these different parts. The dendrites are the first part of that neuron. Again, they're kind of like these finger-like ends. They're going to be the first part that receives that stimulus. In our example, the stimulus is heat, but the stimulus could be anything. It could be if somebody came up and smacked me in the back of the head, the dendrites that are in my, that are right there at my, at my skin and at my head are going to pick up that sensation of pain and send a message to my brain that interprets that as pain. There may not be a response that's needed. It may send a message to my brain saying, I don't like that guy, and I might smack him back or something, but that's a whole other situation, I guess. Or in the event that, let's say, I'm talking about the dendrites in my stomach. There's a sensation of hunger when my stomach is empty, right? So what happens is there's going to be a signal that's sent from neuron to neuron to neuron up to my brain. We're going to talk about this part of the brain, but specifically called the hypothalamus in my brain. And the hypothalamus is going to say, hey, my stomach's empty. So then the response may be the motor response, where I then go to the kitchen and go get a snack. But that's what's happening, is that message is going to be sent. So the dendrites are the ones that pick up on that initial stimulus. From there, that it's going to be transmitted through the cell body. Just look at the cell body as just the main part of that neuron. We didn't talk too much about cells in week 1. We skipped over that chapter. So you don't need to worry about how that purple center right there is called the nucleus. For those of you guys that might be familiar with cells, the nucleus is just the brain of the cell that tells it what its job is. In this case, really all you guys have to know is that this is just the main part of the cell. So the cell body will then, it's going to send that signal down through the axon. The axon, I know that oftentimes is, just like the long portion of the neuron or the tail-like extension there. What happens is this impulse, sometimes referred to as an action potential, but just that impulse, which is just the message that's being sent, is going to be sent really quickly through the axon. And that's because this axon is surrounded by this, what you guys can see as blue in this picture here. It's kind of a soft substance. It's kind of a jelly-like substance that surrounds the axon. This is called myelin sheath. The myelin sheath that surrounds the axon is there to insulate the axon and help to protect it. What we don't see in this picture, guys, is there's also lots of cells, typically in our nervous system, lots of different cells around this neuron called neuroglia. Neuroglia, if we were to see neuroglia in this picture, we'd see them surrounding this entire neuron for protection, to make sure that they stay protected. But the axon is also, because of its exposure there, because it's so long, the axon is really susceptible to damage. So it too provides its own protection by surrounding itself by that myelin sheath. The myelin sheath also helps to speed up the transmission of that impulse. That message is going to be sent very rapidly through the axon, because that myelin sheath helps to, make that possible. So that impulse will be sent very rapidly, then it will make its way down to the end of the axon, so you can just refer to that as the axon terminal, so terminal meaning just end. And then what we're going to see is there's going to be another axon right underneath, and the message will be sent across a space called a synapse. The space between two neurons is referred to as a synapse. That synapse, what happens is the message is actually going to be sent across that space through chemical transmission called neurotransmitters, but I'm not going to ask you anything about that, so you don't need to worry about it. If you are going through in your textbook and you're looking at that, that's what that represents. Neurotransmitters are simply just a chemical that at that axon terminal, that message is sent via chemical pathway to the next neuron, and so on and so forth. So those are the different parts of that particular cell, that neuron, and I'd be familiar with those different parts. As I mentioned, that the axon is surrounded by myelin sheath, so this gives you a better idea of myelin sheath. The spaces in between are referred to as the nodes of Ranvier, that they're not covered by myelin. It's just the specific name given to those. What happens is the message actually, because of the myelin there, the reason why it happens so quickly and so rapidly is because it kind of skips over that myelin real quickly from each node. It goes from one node to the next. Don't worry about neurolema, it's just the inside part there of that myelin sheath. But as long as you know what myelin sheath is is that insulation around the axon, helps to keep it protected and also keeps that message being sent very quickly. And the axon terminal, we showed you guys in the previous slide, that's the end of that axon. So that just gives you a better viewpoint of that myelin sheath there. So I mentioned in my example with the hot stove that there are different types of neurons, that the sensory, what are also going to be referred to as afferent. You're going to see these two terms, and I want you guys to be familiar with these two terms as well. That in the instance where I put my hand on that hot stove, the message that's being sent from my hand to the central nervous system is through sensory neurons. Those sensory or afferent neurons are sending that message that direction. So in other words, they're picking up on that sensation and sending that sensation to be interpreted by whether it's the brain or the spinal cord. The motor, also referred to as efferent neurons, are the opposite. They're the ones that send after that the spinal cord said, hey, that's hot. Now it's being sent through a motor neuron. It's a motor because there's going to be a movement that takes place, some type of response or effect, if that helps, that EF for efferent, that there's going to be an effect that happens now. It carries that information from that central nervous system to the periphery, so meaning to the outside nerves, to elicit some type of response. So that's what happened in that situation. There are what's called interneurons that are found only in the central nervous system, and they just simply connect the sensory and the motor nerves together. So what happens in that instance, again, I lay my hand on the hot stove through sensory neurons or afferent neurons. I always remember A comes before E, so that's how I always remembered afferent, then efferent. So the afferent neurons or sensory neurons are sending that message up my arm and to my central nervous system. It's in the central nervous system that we interpret that as hot. We need to move my hand. So through a motor or an efferent neuron, we're sending that, or through that nerve, that it's sending that message now down to my hand, and my hand will remove itself. In between those two nerves, we have an interneuron that just simply connects it when we get to the spinal cord. So that's what that means. So I would know the difference between afferent and efferent, and as well as those interneurons, and that's what that is. So then we get into white matter versus gray matter. I'll be honest with you guys, I won't test you guys on this, because white matter and gray matter is a little bit different when we're talking about the brain and the spinal cord. So I'm going to go ahead and skip over this. It just talks about, you know, if we were to look into the spinal cord or look into the brain, you'd see this white matter versus gray matter, and you would see that white matter is the myelinated axons, where gray matter are the ones that are unmyelinated. So we'll see just some different, you know, different material there. But let's skip over that. I meant to take that out of your all's PowerPoint. So a nerve impulse. So I mentioned to you guys when we were covering the picture of the neuron, and I said that red arrow was showing the pathway that that nerve impulse takes. So that's what that is. It's just that electrical signal that's being sent through the nerve, so through these neurons. So electrical signals are going to convey that information all along that neuron. They're sometimes referred to as an action potential. So if you see that, it just simply means the message that's being sent. So they move along both sensory and motor neurons depending on, again, the message that's being sent. So here's what happens. So a nerve, you know, impulse, so as that message is being sent down this neuron, so I mentioned that what happens is it happens very rapidly because that message is sent through this axon very quickly because of the myelin sheath. Now, what happens is we have these different charges that takes place. It gets into more of now a little bit of chemistry, which we didn't go too deep into, but just to explain this a little bit further, and I'm not going to test you too deeply on this, but what happens is a neuron at a resting state is referred to as polarization. So we see that there's a negative charge inside the cell and a positive charge outside the cell. This is due to sodium and potassium. Our diet is, you know, is going to be really essential in maintaining our lives as well. So nutrition is really important, and that's something you guys will get into when you take nutrition. But sodium and potassium are important minerals in our body, and they're responsible for nerve transmission as well. Sodium has a negative charge and potassium has a positive charge. What happens is as they move in and out of the cell, it changes the charge, and that's because of messages that are being sent. As a message is being sent, so in a stimulated axon or stimulated neuron, that goes into that stimulated state called depolarization. What happens is that potassium rushes in the cell and pushes that sodium out, and that now is going to be what's happening is that we'll move that message forward. That's how that message can continue to go forward. It isn't something that just magically happens, but when that message needs to go through, that charge is going to happen because of these electrolytes that are in our body. Repolarization is simply just the switch back. So it's the move back to that resting state again. So we are repolarizing. We're going back to polarization. So like I said, I don't want to go too deep into that because it goes a little bit deeper into chemistry, which we kind of skipped over at the beginning. But I always like to explain that a little bit because that message is being sent. Again, it isn't just a magic message that just gets transmitted down that line. It's through these chemicals that are rushing in and out of that cell that are making that movement progress forward. And so that's what that is. Polarization is when our axon or when our neuron is at a resting state. Depolarizing is a stimulated state. And again, it's because of the change of the electricity of our neuron. And then repolarization is just returning back to resting. And so this goes into a little bit more detail about how that happens. That potassium, again, having that positive charge, leaks out of the neuron, and that determines that resting membrane potential. Depolarization, then that sodium rushes in, and then repolarization, potassium rushes back out. So it's just that change of that electrical charge that's taking place within the body there. And so there you can see these charges and the different charges that are occurring. So potassium at the polarization at the resting state, it makes the inside negative when that potassium leaks out. Whereas then in a stimulated state, that sodium leaks or comes into the cell, changing that changing the charge of the neuron. And like I said, I don't want to go too deep into that. For these, I would really just know the difference between what polarization is, depolarization, and then repolarization. And that's the main thing I would know from these couple slides here, guys. I don't want you guys to worry too much about, you know, the change of the charges and, you know, worrying too much about sodium and potassium, but it is sodium and potassium that does give us that ability to transmit these messages. And so that shows you here that myelin insulates the axon. It exposes some of the axon membrane at the nodes of Ranvier, and the action potentials can quickly move from node to node, just like a kangaroo. So that's a fun little analogy there. But that's how that moves so quickly. All right, then we get to the synapse. And the main thing I want you guys to be familiar with is the synapse is that space between two neurons. And so here you can see the first neuron, there's all the dendrites, the cell body, and there's the axon. We just don't see the myelin sheath on this one. But there's that space. They're not, you can see they're not actually touching one another. There's a small space. And what's going to happen is what's called neurotransmitters are going to be sent across that space and make its way then here to the new dendrites of the new neuron. So that's what happens is at the synaptic cleft, at the terminal end of the axon, what happens is we transmit that nerve impulse into these little chemicals called neurotransmitters. Those neurotransmitters then will just move across the space and then make their way to these receptor sites at the next neuron. And that's all the detail I want to get into. I want you guys to just know the space right there between the two neurons is referred to as a synapse, and we send that message across the neuron from one neuron to the next very quickly through these chemical messengers called neurotransmitters. And we don't need to go into any more detail than that. Okay, so I hope that helps a little bit with how messages are sent throughout our nervous system. And I had briefly mentioned to you guys, and I'm trying to think of a good way to show you guys this. So I briefly, before I get into the next division here, as we get into the major areas of the brain, that there are different divisions of the nervous system. And I always like to show it this way, that if we were to look at the nervous system, again, we could break that down into two main divisions. So let me actually stop sharing right here. And we showed that earlier, that we have I can't spell today. The central nervous system and the peripheral nervous system. Remember, we abbreviated that as, well, hold on. I'm going to make this a little bit better. The central nervous system, let me make this a little bit clearer, and the peripheral nervous system. We were to break that down. Okay. Right? We called the nervous system itself, we called that the CNS and the PNS. Now, right now, what we're about to do is we're going to get into, now remember, the central nervous system is either A, the brain, or the spinal cord. The only two parts of that central nervous system. We're going to talk pretty heavily about the brain right now because the brain is such a big part of our nervous system, and we're going to look at how different areas of the brain control different things. But I briefly mentioned earlier that the peripheral nervous system, and I talked about this a little bit last week when we were talking about our muscles, but our peripheral nervous system either controls our voluntary functions or our involuntary functions. And this is something that may not be covered in this particular PowerPoint, but it is something that I do want you guys to be familiar with. And it's probably in your book too. I don't have a textbook with me right now, but it is very important to be familiar with. And that's referred to as the somatic. Somatic is the voluntary muscle movement. So this is the movement of our skeletal muscle. Remember, our skeletal muscle is the only muscle in our body that we choose to use. So our somatic is a synonym for voluntary muscle movement, but I'm just going to put skeletal because that's the part of the nervous system that controls our skeletal muscle. Okay, well, where does the rest of the movement in our body take place? Two more muscle tissues, right? Smooth muscle, cardiac muscle. Both of those we know are very automatic functions of our body. So this part of the nervous section or the nervous system is what's called the autonomic. I'm writing a little small here. Autonomic. That you can't see. I'll write it real big. Autonomic. I'm writing it right down there at the that's supposed to be here, the other division of our peripheral nervous system. Autonomic is what I oftentimes think of as our automatic functions in our body. This is our smooth and our muscle. Our smooth muscle and our cardiac muscle, because we are not in control of that. Those are things that automatically take place for us. And so it's our autonomic division. So our nerves are going to be what controls that. And we'll see that when we talk about our brain, how our brain controls things like our breathing, right? Our brain controls our heartbeat. Our brain, if we didn't have our brain, we wouldn't be able to sense that it's hot outside, but those are things like sweating is something that automatically takes place for us. Things like my blood moving through my circulatory system. Obviously, I don't have to think about that happening. It's going to do that already. So my smooth muscle pushing that through is going to happen. That's going to help that happen. Now, that can then be further divided a little bit more. Now let's imagine, I want you guys to think about the things that are automatically happening to you right now at this very moment. Right now, your heart is probably beating pretty normally. You're sitting there and you're probably bored to death watching an anatomy video, but you're sitting here watching that anatomy video and your heart is functioning pretty normal, right? Let's say, wherever you are at this point in time, let's say you're in your room or you're at school watching this video. Let's say somebody throws a brick through your window. What would happen to your heart rate? It would go crazy, right? You're automatically going to see a rush in your heart rate, a rush in your breathing. All kinds of other changes are going to take place in your body. Adrenaline is going to circulate, and we'll talk about that when we get to our endocrine system. But that is a change in our autonomic functioning. So when I say it can be divided up a little bit further, it's now going to be divided up whether we're in a stressed state or a relaxed state. So if you ever hear the divisions of the autonomic system being divided into what's called sympathetic, let me write that down, sympathetic or parasympathetic. That's the difference. I didn't think about how I'm going to run out of space here. Okay, so that autonomic system can then be divided a little bit further into the sympathetic or parasympathetic. In the sympathetic, I always think S for stress. That now our sympathetic nervous system means that my body is in a fight or flight mode where adrenaline's pumping, we feel like we need to go into survival mode, our heart rate is increased, and those are the big things to know. What also is going to happen in your sympathetic response, what also happens is your pupils dilate, your sweat glands open up, your digestion actually slows down because you're focusing on other things at the time. You're going to go get more energy. Your body's going to go get more sugar from the storage in your liver, and you're going to have more to use. And so, not that you guys need to know that, as long as you guys know your heart rate's increased, your breathing's increased, and again, that's what that means. Your sympathetic nervous division is your stress division of your automatic functionings, your heart rate, everything else. Whereas the parasympathetic is now going back to a resting state. Once you realized that that threat is gone, whatever it was, let's say it was a brick, you filed a police report, it's been hours, and you realize it was just a neighborhood kid who was, being crazy. And either way, the stress is gone. That's my point. The stress is gone. So now your heart rate's going back to normal. Digestion is picking back up again. Your breathing is going back to normal. Everything is going back to normal. That's what parasympathetic is going back to that resting homeostasis. So I always like to show that the nervous system can be divided a little bit further based on what it's controlling. So if we were to take a look again at our nervous system, we're going to get ready to talk a little bit further about the central nervous system right now, but specifically the brain. And then the peripheral nervous system either controls our automatic functioning, so our skeletal muscle tissue. Did I say automatic? I'm sorry, our voluntary function, so the things that we are under control. So our somatic, which is our skeletal muscle, whereas the autonomic are the things that we are not in control of, Those are automatic functioning, so our smooth muscle and our cardiac muscle. But that is either being controlled in a stressed state, which I say stressed, like we always think stress, like in fight or flight mode. But our sympathetic nervous system is actually active in an exercise state too, meaning like we are, if we're running on the treadmill, that's not anything that's really stressful, but it's to our body, it's being stressed for a good reason, but it's increasing my heart rate, increasing my sweat glands, and so on and so forth. So that's what that means. So stressed, sympathetic, and parasympathetic, meaning that we're in a resting state or we're going back to normal. So I would know that about the peripheral nervous system too. So that's something I will ask you guys about. Okay, let's go back to our PowerPoint. Our PowerPoint, I want to talk to you guys about now the brain. So that's what we're going to look at here in section 2 of chapter 10. So the brain and protection of the central nervous system. So we'll talk about how we have what's called meninges that are going to protect these organs. So we're going to take a look at the functions of the 4 major areas of the brain and 4 lobes of what's called the cerebrum. That's the biggest part of the brain. And we're going to take a look at how the skull, meninges, what's called cerebrospinal fluid, as well as the blood-brain barrier are going to help to protect our brain and spinal cord. Okay, so let's go a little bit further here. Okay, there we go. So we have 4 major areas of the brain. So looking at this picture here, this major part of the brain that we think of when we think of the brain itself, all the different folds and grooves of the brain, this entire pink section of the brain is its own division. It's called the cerebrum. So we'll talk about this. The cerebrum can actually be divided into 4 different lobes. And those lobes are a little bit easy because last week we talked about the bones that are right in front of those lobes, and they're named the same. We'll have the frontal lobe, the parietal lobe, the occipital lobe, and the temporal lobe. So hopefully all those names sound familiar to us. Inside the brain, if we were to cut it open and open it up big, we would see this, what they have colored as purple right here. That's just the inner space in the brain. This is called the diencephalon. Here we're going to see in that diencephalon, we're going to see 2 divisions of the brain called the thalamus and the hypothalamus. And so we'll focus a little bit more on the hypothalamus, but we'll take a look at those 2 sections of the diencephalon. Then we're going to take a look at what they have colored as green right here. This is what we know as our brainstem. Our brainstem has 3 parts, the midbrain, the pons, and the medulla oblongata. And I'll talk to you guys about those 3 parts and what they do, but mostly focusing on that medulla oblongata, and I'll explain why. And then this last part, this kind of ball-shaped structure at the very base of the brain is called the cerebrum. And that we can look at, it doesn't have any further parts like the other sections do. But we'll look at the cerebrum and its involvement in our coordination. So let's take a look at those 4 areas. So we're going to first start with the cerebrum. So again, I know earlier we said don't worry about gray and white matter. It's a little bit different in the brain versus the spinal cord, but I do want you guys to know that the outer part of the cerebrum, again, the cerebrum was this entire pink section of the brain. This entire thing is called the cerebrum. The outer surface of this itself, so again, really the brain-like, again, tissue there that we see, that outer part that has the folds and grooves in it is called the cerebral cortex. We'll see the term cortex in a couple different places, but typically cortex means outside. So right on the outside there is your cerebral cortex. It's just the outermost portion of that cerebrum. Whereas on the inside, the bulk of the cerebrum, if we were to cut it open and look, we would see that that's made up of white matter, and that's right beneath the cerebral cortex. On that cerebrum, those folds and grooves have specific names. Gyrus or gyri, if we're looking at all of them together, are the convolutions. They're the ones that are the folds. If we were to look at them as like hills and valleys of that cerebrum or that cerebral cortex, the hills are the gyri, or gyrus, again, if we're looking at just one of them. So gyrus is singular, gyri means plural. So that's what those are, the convolutions, the hills, and these hills and valleys. Whereas then the folds in between, or the grooves in between, are sometimes referred to as fissures or sulci or a sulcus if you're looking at just one of those. There are some specific fissures in our brain, the central fissure, the lateral fissure, and the longitudinal, which you don't need to worry too much about. I just want you guys to know that the grooves in between are referred to as those sulci. So here you can see the central sulcus and the lateral sulcus in this picture here, and then the longitudinal we can't see in this picture, it's at the top there. But just know that again, just know that sulcus are the grooves in between. You see there's more sulci, you know, throughout the entire brain. The hill parts are again called the gyri, and the grooves in between are sulci. So be familiar with those. Whereas then the cerebrum itself can then be further divided into 4 main lobes, again named according to the bones that protect them. So you see here in pink we have the frontal lobe. In blue we see the parietal lobe, so named again according to that same bone. At the very back we have the occipital lobe, and then we have the temporal lobe. So each of these lobes actually have different things to do in our body. They're responsible for different actions. In the frontal lobe, this is the executive, because here it's here in the front. It's responsible for things like behavior, personality, and our motor movements. So our skeletal muscle movement is, you know, because of the frontal lobe. So imagine if any damage was done to the frontal lobe, we would probably have some changes in our behavior, the way that our personality typically is, and then maybe even our control of our arms and our legs, and the way that we walk and we move. So the frontal lobe is, again, in control of lots of different things. So there it shows that we have the frontal lobe, and you'll see they've pointed to specific areas and what they do, but we'll look at these as just as each section. So the parietal lobe, the somatosensory area, the big thing to know about the parietal lobe, it says here that it has a gustatory area. It is responsible for some taste sensation, as well as the temporal lobe, but we'll kind of focus on certain things to note from each one. As far as why there's a gustatory area in parietal and temporal, because you're not secluded, these certain things are not secluded to just one lobe. It may move across, you know, different divisions of the brain. So parietal lobe, you know it as different, it's got some different sensory areas, and then also some taste. Temporal, the big thing to be familiar with the temporal is the temporal, if we remember when we were talking about the parts of the skull, remember there was that big hole in the opening to the temporal lobe. That was the opening of our ear canal. Our temporal lobe in the brain, which is right behind that bone, has what's called our auditory cortex. It is going to be responsible for the hearing sensation that we pick up on. There is a taste and a smell area there. That's what gustatory and olfactory mean. We'll talk about that a little bit more in the next chapter. But definitely focus on the fact that the temporal lobe controls our hearing sensation, whereas our occipital lobe is responsible for vision. So if we go back to this picture, you can see our frontal lobe. Remember that it has a lot of our behavior and personality and motor movements. It's what that is in control of. Our parietal lobe, be familiar with taste. You know, there's another sensory area, but be familiar with how taste is controlled here. With our temporal lobe, how we have our control of hearing in our temporal lobe. And then know that our occipital lobe is responsible for our vision. So that puts that all together for us. So our cerebrum is responsible for lots and lots of different things in our body. Okay, and that shows us that again. All right, so let's move to the next section of our brain. So the cerebrum, we just talked about the biggest section of our brain, but then we cut open the brain and look on the inside, we would find a space called the diencephalon. The diencephalon has 2 parts. We have the thalamus and then the hypothalamus. So here they're pointing out the thalamus as green, and then the hypothalamus here in purple. The thalamus really kind of serves as kind of like a switching station, that it's going to be what's in control of moving messages to the different divisions of our cerebrum, so where those different messages need to go. So that's all you really need to know about the thalamus. The hypothalamus, however, is very important in our body. Not that the thalamus is very important, but the hypothalamus, I oftentimes refer to this as our body's regulator. It is very close to our body's pituitary gland, which is something we'll talk about in our hormones chapter when we talk about the endocrine system. And the pituitary gland, you guys will find, is very, very important because a lot of hormones are released by the pituitary gland. And the hypothalamus has a big role to play in that, in its control of the pituitary gland. But I call it the regulator because it's responsible for a lot of our body's homeostasis reactions and maintaining that homeostasis, I should say. A lot of the things that keep us normal and keep us regular, such as our appetite. Our appetite is controlled here in the hypothalamus. When my body recognizes that I'm hungry, that message is sent here to the hypothalamus. Sometimes emotions are controlled by the hypothalamus. Our sleep. When our body recognizes that we need to sleep, we'll see how the hypothalamus helps us to control, the biological clock. So lots and lots of different things, but I would remember definitely appetite, sleep, and also temperature regulation. When my body recognizes that it's hot or cold outside, those messages are sent here to the hypothalamus. So let's remember those three things mostly, that the hypothalamus is in control of a lot of regulatory functions in our body, such as sleep, appetite, and temperature regulation. And that, again, you can see why that hypothalamus is so important for our body. And so that's there in that diencephalon. Okay. Our brain stem, so going back to that picture real quickly, you can see the brain stem is right underneath the diencephalon, divided into three different sections. We have the midbrain, which is just that, it's right there in the middle of the brain. This rounded portion, this bulge portion, is the pons, and then we have the medulla, or the medulla oblongata is what that's referred to as. So our midbrain is a reflex center, so helping in our spinal cord and responsibility for our reflexes. Pons can also be kind of a connector, a switching station. But the biggest thing I really want you guys to focus on here is the medulla oblongata. The medulla oblongata, and for those of you guys who are familiar with the movie Waterboy, you might be laughing when you hear that term. If you haven't seen Waterboy, go watch it. It's a stupid, silly movie, but there's a part in it that the term medulla oblongata comes up in kind of a funny way. But it's really a big part of our brain because it's not big in size, but big in responsibility. And that the medulla oblongata is our vital center. It also says our emetic center, so it's going to be what sends our signal to our body to tell us when we need to vomit. So that's great. But that sometimes is necessary. But the biggest role that it has, when I say vital, it's in control of our vital functions. So our breathing, our heart rate, as well as our blood pressure is controlled by this medulla oblongata. So pretty much the reason why we're alive today is because my medulla oblongata in the brain, so it's the last part of the brain right before it connects to the spinal cord, but because of that division of the brain, we are able to breathe, our heart is able to function properly, and our blood pressure is affected by that heart rate, but that blood pressure is controlled there by the medulla oblongata. So I would definitely be familiar with that section of the brainstem. So I would know that the brainstem, what that looks like, the midbrain, the pons, and the medulla oblongata, but, definitely be familiar with those different, those different, where they are, but the medulla oblongata itself, for sure. That's the biggest part on that one. And then lastly, the cerebellum. If we were to go back and look at that picture, again, that rounded portion at the very base of our brain is called the cerebellum. Our cerebellum is the kind of, if we could just summarize the functioning of the cerebellum just in one word, I would tell you balance or coordination. That it's, again, located at the base of the skull. It helps to mediate the reflexes, but it coordinates that motor activity. It helps to evaluate our sensory input as well, but the biggest thing is, again, knowing that coordination. So it's our cerebrum that we talked about. The frontal lobe of the cerebrum is responsible for our motor movements, but it's here in the cerebellum that's gonna help to coordinate those motor movements. So I always tell people that, yes, the reason why I can walk around is because of the cerebrum, but the reason why I can walk without tripping is because of the cerebellum. So sometimes if we're thrown off balance, it could be something with our cerebellum. We'll talk about in the next chapter how off balance could also have something to do with our ears too. So I'll talk about how that has a role in balance too. So you guys, actually, there's some different sections in our brain that go across different divisions of the brain. So mainly be familiar with what we have on here. We have what's called the limbic system, which is our responsibility of our emotions. We have the reticular formation, which is what helps to control our consciousness, our sleep when we're in a coma. That it's this division of the brain that it's, controlling that sleep-wake cycle, the consciousness, the gaze center. So that division of the brain, so again called the reticular formation, is responsible for that action. And then we have different memory areas in the brain as well. So knowing that, know if I asked you guys about the limbic system, that's our emotional brain, and the reticular formation and its responsibility for helping with sleep and consciousness. All right. So how are these different divisions of the brain protected? So because our brain is so responsible and so important for our lives, we have lots of different protective coatings around the brain. One, we talked about how we have our cranial bones that are going to protect the outside part of that brain there. But even further than that, the brain itself, between the bone and the brain, we have meninges sitting on top of the brain. Then on top of the meninges, we have cerebrospinal fluid and circulating throughout, and then we have the blood-brain barrier. So all kinds of different ways that our brain is protected. So let's first take a look at what these meninges are. So here you can see in this picture, so we've cut a different, just this top section of the brain. And here you can see the brain itself. And these meninges sit right on top of that. Our meninges are actually divided into 3 different layers. So we have 3 layers of protection sitting right on top of the brain. Meninges, if you guys have heard of the term meningitis, this is when our meninges unfortunately get infected. And there's different forms of meningitis. There's bacterial meningitis and all kinds of different ones. But that's where that term comes from, because it's the inflammation of these meninges. But these 3 different layers, so starting from the outermost to the innermost, which is sitting right on top of the brain, the outermost layer is called the dura mater. It's the tough outermost layer outside, the different meninges. Then we have what's called the arachnoid matter. So the very next layer is called arachnoid. In the layer between the arachnoid and the pia mater, there is a space that's referred to as the subarachnoid space. There is a subdural space too, between the dura and the arachnoid matter. But the reason why this is pointed out for us, and you can see it in this picture, this space between the arachnoid and the pia mater, you can see the arachnoid produces these kind of these web-like fibers that are going down and connecting to that pia mater. And so that's where that term arachnoid comes from. If anybody has, associates that word arachnoid, maybe has heard of the term arachnophobia, which is fear of spiders, that arachnoid, you can tie it, and that's why they have this picture of a spider web down here to show those little fibers that are kind of web-like, to help remember that. So the dura mater, but then the next layer is the arachnoid matter. The space underneath that is what's called just the subarachnoid space. And then we have the pia mater, the very thin layer that sits right on top of the brain itself. That's our last meninge there, the last layer of our meninges. So I would be familiar with that. I had some nursing students one quarter that told me that they remember DAP or DAP, and that's how they remember dura, arachnoid, pia, as the layers of our meninges. Okay. Then we have cerebrospinal fluid. Cerebrospinal fluid is a fluid that's formed, what it says there, in our ventricles. If we were to look at the inside of our brain, and I don't have a picture of this, but there are some spaces on the inside of the brain called ventricles. And that's all you guys have to know. There are certain ones, but you just have to know that there's a few spaces inside the brain called ventricles. Those ventricles create a fluid called cerebrospinal fluid. This cerebrospinal fluid is going to circulate through that subarachnoid space that we were just talking about, that space between the arachnoid and the pia mater. So from the central canal, the spinal cord, and then you don't have to worry about foramina. We didn't talk about that. But it circulates. It's going to circulate and provide a protection, an insulation, a lubrication to make sure that, my brain isn't bouncing up against the wall of the skull, that it's going to provide that fluid's going to help to provide that, that barrier there to make sure that doesn't happen. So here you can see how it circulates around the brain, and how it also is going to circulate around the spinal cord as well. And then our blood-brain barrier. So made up of just different cells. Astrocytes are going to actually be a certain type of neuroglia. I didn't want you guys to have to worry about the different types of neuroglia, so I took that off of there. But that's what that blood-brain barrier is it does have some neuroglia cells in it within the blood vessels, within, you know, the cerebrum. And that's simply just the role of that is to prevent any toxins from entering into the cerebral spinal fluid from blood. Sometimes blood can pick up bacteria or pick up viruses. Blood can pick that up just, you know, in all kinds of different places throughout our body. Or, you know, if we get a cut in our skin and bacteria gets in, blood's going to continue to circulate all over the body, and we don't want it to get into our central nervous system. So the blood-brain barrier is going to help with that, with those just specialized cells. So that's all you guys really have to know about that. Okay, so that is the end. Oh, I meant to. Okay. So that is the end of chapter 10. I know that was kind of short and sweet, but be familiar with the different divisions of the nervous system. Be familiar with the functions of the nervous system. Again, remember our little picture here, the nervous system. I'll probably give you guys a better picture to help with studying. I know that's not a very good picture. Be familiar with the neuron and the different parts of the neuron. Know what neuroglia cells do. How they, again, they're designed to protect, and be familiar with the brain and the different parts that we talked about today. You know, with the brain, really focus on the cerebrum as the largest part of the brain, and the 4 lobes that the cerebrum can be divided into and what each lobe does. Remember, we focused on frontal, control of our motor movements, our personality, as well as our behavior. We know that the parietal lobe was in control of our taste, the temporal lobe was in control of hearing, and the occipital lobe was in control of our vision. Now, obviously, the cerebrum controls a lot more than that, but those are some things that I wanted you guys to focus on. In the diencephalon, we found the thalamus and the hypothalamus. The big thing to focus on there is the hypothalamus and its role in regulation, like sleep, appetite, temperature control. Be familiar with the brain stem, where we found the midbrain, the pons, and the medulla oblongata. And the medulla oblongata is, again, responsible for life because it's in control of our heart rate and our breathing. And know that the cerebellum controls our coordination. And then what we just finished up with our protection, be familiar with the 3 meninges. Know that cerebrospinal fluid is a fluid that circulates around our brain and our spinal cord for protection, provides a lubrication, also helps from chemicals getting into our brain as well, and the blood-brain barrier. All right, guys, if you all have any questions, please don't hesitate to ask.